Hello gamers, and welcome to Wargaming Wisdom, where we try to be a better tactician every day. Today's topic is cheap infantry and how to use them to the greatest effect. We'll go over ways to make cheap infantry more effective, how to deal with it, and perhaps its most important use, tar pitting. So cheap infantry has a lot of different names depending on the wargame system that you're using. People call them chaff, cannon fodder, speed bumps, tar pits. These units are extremely cheap bodies. They're going to have crappy armor or no armor. They're going to have pitiful weapons. They are very easy to kill, and their only good quality is their quantity. So in bolt action, we have inexperienced infantry, for example. 70 points for 10 of these guys versus 100 points for regular infantry. In Warmahordes, there's the Bokor and Bogtrog Swamp Shamblers. In Mark IV, they are 5 points for 6 models. That is extreme value. It's very rare to see units that are under 1 point per model, but you can see that there's a very good reason for it. Speed 5 is slow, Mat 5 is your ability to hit things, that's very low. Defense 10 is super low, Armor 13 is quite low as well. These things are going to die to a stiff breeze pretty much. Here's a slightly more expensive unit that costs 6 points for 5 guys, and you can see they have a slightly higher Mat, that's your attack rolls, and their defense and armor are higher. They have a little bit more damage output. In 40k, these are going to be like guardsmen, Kroot, Hormagaunts, essentially massed troops. So why do you need these guys? Well, in some war games, like 40k, troops are usually better at holding objectives, which is important, and in others, like bolt action, only infantry can hold objectives. And yeah, you could take more elite infantry that's harder to kill, it's better at shooting, they have better guns, but let's take bolt action as an example. I've got a rifle squad of 7 men for 70 points at regular. These guys are more accurate and they're harder to kill. Or I have 10 guys for 70 points at inexperienced. That's 3 more men per unit. If we've got 4 units, that means I have 12 extra guys. That's 12 extra dice that I can throw down onto the table when firing rifles at you. And this is pretty universal across every game. You're going to need higher to hit rolls. So you need, say, 5s instead of 4s. Well, if I'm throwing down 12 extra dice, then the math starts to even out a little bit. And I have more bodies, meaning that you have to kill more things. It's going to take you more activations of more units to get rid of them. We'll ignore stuff like morale just for the moment. I'll get to that in a second. So instead of bringing a bunch of regular infantry, I bring inexperienced infantry, and then I can bring a Stuart tank with the points savings that I have. And the Stuart tank has 4 machine guns and an HE weapon that it can fire at you, meaning that it can pretty much clear an entire infantry squad every single turn. So I can either have way more bodies than you, or I can use those point savings and get something to deal with your own infantry. So here's a good example. I've got 30 inexperienced infantry here, and I've got 30 regular infantry. And we've got 2 officers that we can put with our units and buff their morale. So that's one way that you can make chaff more effective, is by taking things that will make them tougher or harder to chase off by forcing morale checks. You can also take something like a medic, and then the massive losses that you're taking on the inexperienced infantry is somewhat reduced. But because I have inexperienced infantry here and I'm saving 90 points, it allows me to take an M3 Lee and an M3 Stuart. So I have, and this is a Stuart with all the fixins, right? We've got 1,000,000 machine guns on this thing. So this is a pretty powerful 1,000 point army. We have 60 units of infantry, a couple of officers to stiffen them up, make them a little bit harder to break. And we've got 2 powerful armored units, which are really good at dealing with infantry, and we've got enough anti-tank guns that we can fire a few shots at a tank and probably cause some pins and maybe get some penetrating shots. But let's say instead of British, we went with a massive wave of the cheapest infantry that you can possibly buy. Instead of having rifles, the bamboo spear fighters of the Japanese are considered probably one of the cheesiest units in the game. They literally have pointed sticks.
Unpointed sticks.
but you can take 15 of them for 75 points, which is only 5 more points than a 10-man inexperienced rifle squad. So that's 300 points, meaning that we could take 3 platoons of just bamboo spear fighters, and then we'd have enough points left over to take anti-tank grenades on a few of them. Right, plus 2 points per man. That brings the squad's cost up to just over 100 points for 15 guys that, yeah, I mean, you're gonna kill them with machine guns and HE attacks and even rifles, but these units have special rules that make it so they pretty much always succeed on a charge, and you're gonna have like 140 infantrymen on the board. That is a seriously large number of bodies that you have to deal with as an enemy force facing these guys. My British platoon had less than half of that number of bodies. So, do you have enough machine guns and HE attacks and rifles to deal with 150 guys? That's the question that you have to ask. So one thing you can do with chaff is to use them instead of more elite infantry so that you can afford bigger and better toys like tanks or anti-tank guns. If we're talking war machine, maybe you take some Creel warriors so that you can take a couple units of cavalry like long riders or something like that. Or the other way to look at it is you just spam nothing but chaff, and if the enemy doesn't have enough anti-chaff weapons to deal with them, they're just going to get completely overwhelmed. And to look at this from a Battletech perspective, because infantry works a little bit differently and we're dealing with a much larger scale, when we're talking about chaff in Battletech, we're talking about really small, super cheap units that you can just swarm the enemy with. And in particular, these cheap units should probably be able to generate high TMM. So you can have 2 Spider 9Ms, really powerful, fast, close-range unit, has enough armor that it can take a couple hits from bigger weapons without completely crumpling, with an 18 damage alpha strike at close range, -3 to hit, so even if they're jumping, they're still pretty accurate. And then you can take a full lance of small laser Savannah Masters that are so fast that the short range of the small lasers doesn't even matter. They can just teleport behind you and blow your back armor out. So you can take these 6 units for the cost of 1 awesome, and that's giving you a lot of units that you can sync initiative with, and it's giving you a lot of units that the enemy has to shoot at. Because when like an awesome is faced with a bunch of enemies that are super small and hard to hit, it can't exactly split its fire because it's going to take multi-target penalties. So it's forced to fire all of its weapons at one of these things, and let's say gunnery 4, probably medium range when they're coming in, or right in your face in minimum range, so that's even worse. So we'll say +2, so that's 6, and then all of these can generate 4 TMM really easily, so that's 10s pretty much just automatically all the time that you have to hit on. And then if the awesome has moved, or if it's under the effects of heat, or there's any cover involved, you're looking at 11s or 12s. So just like with the bamboo infantry, you're overwhelming a single aspect of the game. You just have way too many hard to hit targets, or way too many bodies, and the enemy can't deal with you before you get into your effective range. For the bamboo fighters, as soon as they get into melee charging range, these guys will just rip any infantry squad apart pretty much. And if you give anti-tank grenades to a couple of the squads, then those squads specifically can deal with any armor that the enemy has. And of course, if you just wipe out the 3 or 6 infantry squads that the enemy has, then your bamboo fighters can hold any objectives on the board. Tanks can't hold objectives in bolt action. Typically, at least. I'm sure some people do things a little bit differently. Then there's ways that you can make chaff even more effective. Like I went over, you can take medics, you can take officers to boost morale, depending on the system. In War Machine, you have casters like Madrak Ironhide, who has a +2 defense aura for the entire army. So suddenly these Creel warriors go from being hit on 5s or 6s by most units to 7s or 8s. So when you spam out 20 of these guys, they're not easy to kill. They've got bonus armor against melee. They've got defense 14. They have the tough rule. rifle, so they get a 5-up save, which is not something that units in War Machine normally get. Then you add the Creelstone aura on top of that. They get +2 armor, so now they're armor 19 against melee attacks. So buffing your chaff and polishing a turd can really make it so that those numbers that you have become even more overwhelming. It's like, yeah, you've got 100 really crappy dudes on the table that aren't really going to do a whole lot, but all of a sudden you're reducing their losses with a medic, you're making them harder to break with morale checks, or you're boosting up their defense and making them way more accurate, or you're going with someone like Ragnar who has a massive damage boost. Suddenly those attacks that were a little bit wimpy are moving up on that bell curve. Now they can crack some armor, now they can deal some damage. And it's not just the crappy models that you can buff with these. You can polish up these turds and make them a lot more effective, but then you can also use all these same buffs on more elite units like cavalry and get a really big boost to their damage as well. And you can afford these units because you took a bunch of cheap chaff. So now that we've seen how incredibly effective chaff units can be, the question is, how do we deal with them? Well, there's a few ways. You can use your own chaff. They typically have good anti-chaff weapons, right? Rifles and machine guns are pretty effective against units like these until they get into melee. You can take AoE weapons like flamethrowers, weapons with like HE explosion templates. If we're talking 40k, you've got your guardsmen, right? And then you can have behind them a hellhound, something with flamers, so that if enemy chaff, like a unit of melee weapon wielding cultists, try and get on top of you, you can just burn them out before they even get there. And that brings me to our final point, which is tar pitting. This is one of the most effective things that you can do with chaff. In most wargaming systems, when you engage someone in melee combat, it's hard for them to disengage from that. In 40k, you literally can't use your ranged weapons while engaged in melee combat. In War Machine, you typically can't shoot either, and if you try and move away, you get hit for free with a really powerful attack. And in 40k, you straight up just can't disengage unless you have special rules, like some jump or flying capable units can. So if the enemy's got a big tank that has lots of guns and you're scared of it, you can send a unit in, and these are called either tar pits or jammers, units that are good at getting into combat because they're relatively quick or they have a big charging threat range. So Hormagaunts are a great example of this in 40k. They're really fast, they've got lots of cheap bodies, and you can throw a unit of like 20 of them at a tank and just jam it up. It locks out its ranged weapons. It probably isn't going to kill the tank because they're not great at dealing damage to big tough units, but they don't need to kill it, they just need to keep it from shooting for a few turns, and they will have earned their battle value back. And that's what wargaming is all about, really, is just taking units that are going to be effective, and they don't necessarily have to do damage to be effective. They just have to earn their points back that you spent on them. And a cheap unit of infantry jamming up a tank or holding an objective, that's earning their points. You can also use more elite units to jam and tar pit things, and they're going to be a lot harder to kill. So long riders, for example, they're really expensive, but they're pretty fast, and they can charge in and jam up an enemy unit, and unless that unit is extremely powerful, they're not going to die. They are super tanky. So you can do a similar thing with like Terminators for Space Marines, that deep strike near something that you want to jam up and then charge it the turn after. Because infantry is typically slow, you can also use transports. I like to take a couple of Gurkhas, stick them in a Bren carrier. That's a pretty durable unit. It needs anti-tank guns to kill it unless you charge it in melee. So it's just this little armored transport unit, but you rush it up the board. It's pretty fast compared to infantry. It moves twice the speed. And you've got a little unit of elite infantry in there, and they're not even jammers. They'll just go up and kill enemy squads. But you can do this with trucks in bolt action, with inexperienced infantry, just unload them right in front of an enemy unit that you need jammed up, like a tank. Charge in, get right on top of it, and you can do the same thing in 40k with a chimera and a unit of guardsmen, right? You drive the chimera forward, it protects the guardsmen on the way in. It has a couple of anti-chaff guns of its own so that it doesn't get jammed itself. And then you unload the guardsmen right in front of an enemy tank. They move up and charge it the next turn. That thing is jammed for at least a couple of turns until they can get something in there to fight the guardsmen, because you can't shoot into melee typically with most war games. So how do you deal with tarpitting units? They're going to come up, they're going to jam up your expensive guns, they're going to chase squads off of their artillery pieces. Like if a unit of guardsmen goes and jams up a land raider or something, they are quadrupling their points in effectiveness by jamming up that land raider for a couple of turns. And that's a huge problem for you. So one thing that you can do is bring units that cause any kind of fear. In some war games you have fear rules or things that cause morale checks. In Bolt Action, you have the Germans with Tiger Fear. You've got penalties to units' morale checks because there's a big, scary German tank there. Anything that causes morale checks, even if you've got an officer behind them, typically, chaff units are going to have poor morale. They're going to get chased off. Flamethrowers are really good at doing this in pretty much every game. In Bolt Action, they cause lots of pins. In 40k, they just do lots of damage to chaff squads. In War Machine, you also have like AoE weapons that will do lots of damage to clumped up units. Or like I said, you can bring the Doka. You can bring just a bunch of weapons that spam out lots and lots of shots, especially with tanks that are hard for infantry to kill. It can be pretty effective, especially because vehicles are often faster than infantry, so you can kind of just back up, keep shooting them as they're trying to get at you. Eventually they're going to like back you into the corner of the board, but hopefully by then you've thinned their numbers to a sufficient degree or brought in your own infantry support that you can deal with them. So flamers, big Doka guns, and anything that causes morale checks, fear, panic checks, that kind of stuff. These are all the ways that you can deal with infantry. You can also bring like your own elite melee units that are really good at dealing with infantry. So things that make a lot of attacks or have like flame pistols. That's a thing in some games where you can use pistols in melee. So I hope this helps gamers learning how to use chaff, how to counter them, and how to make them more effective. Knowing how to use them, or at least how to counter them, is extremely crucial to your overall strategy. If you enjoyed this, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more, and share it with your friends. Thanks for watching, happy gaming, and have a great day, everyone.
The jammers are legion.